Thank you for that introduction. This is going to be essentially a lightning round conversation. We have less than 10 minutes, so we'll move quickly. But that's something that I know Hans Ulrich is a skill he's sort of mastered. This amazing book really collects a bunch of different texts by artists, writers, I'm in it, who have been influenced by, supported by, who are friends with Hans Ulrich. And I want to start, I was talking to the novelist Lynn Tillman about you yesterday, and Lynn is a New York-based novelist, and I said I was having this conversation, and she said, well, you need to ask him first what makes a great conversation. And so I'm curious how a conversation begins for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much, Steffi. Actually, and greetings to Lynn. The idea, I mean, there are so many, aspects, I think, to a conversation. First of all, is when it's a great conversation, it never ends, because you always want to continue it. So I think that's the idea of Blanchot, of the conversation infinie, of the endless conversation, in a way. The other thing maybe is also that we somehow go beyond the idea of talking about things which exist, and that it's about, as Ben Vickers always says, about world making, so that in a conversation we can invent worlds, that it actually leads to the production of reality. And that's why, the only recurrent question in all these conversations is always, and you could see today with all the artists, it's the question about the unrealized project, because it's about, hopefully then making some of these projects happen. So production of reality maybe is another aspect. I think the third thing is probably to listen. At the beginning, I always had endlessly long questions, and I think over time, the questions became shorter and shorter, and I think, as Lightening says, it's about maybe learning to listen, and I think we need to every day somehow, something we need to learn every day to listen. And I think it's important for the 21st century. The 20th century was a century of many loud, manifestos, and I think now it's important to listen, not only to each other, but to listen to basically to listen to plants, to listen to trees.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by, in your curation and in your interviews, they seem not to be based simply on like a kind of map making or even a kind of history creation, but actually on a kind of friendship and a kind of engagement with an artist on a very personal level. And I'm curious about, for example, having a book like this produced, where you've produced so many books about artists, what the experience of reading a book about yourself by artists was like. And
yeah, in a way, I think it's a book more about the exhibitions than about about myself. I think it has to do with portraits of certain exhibitions, because each of these stories is related often to an exhibition and or also the genesis of an exhibition. And I mean, to give you an example, Lightening, the poet, to stay with her and artist, she's really at the origin of my Instagram exhibition, which I do every day, where I protest against the disappearance of handwriting and doodling. And we were with Etel in a cafe. It was raining outside, and all of a sudden, we sort of started to answer things on our phone after many hours of talking to each other. And Etel, of course, doesn't have a smartphone, so she took out a little notebook and wrote down a poem. And I thought it was unbelievably beautiful, so I took a picture, posted it on Instagram, and that really triggered that whole, ongoing exhibition. So it's often related, I would say, to that.
I mean, these are, being that they're all centered around exhibitions that you helped create and bring into the world, did you learn anything about the exhibition by reading this book that you hadn't, or even yourself, that you hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, I was very touched by Agnes Varda, and I'd like to remember here the late Agnes Varda, the great filmmaker who passed away sadly last year. And it's one of her last texts she wrote is actually for this book. And it was very fascinating for me to kind of read her perspective on getting our invitation in 2006 from Rick Ritter, Van Nisha, and myself, and also Molly Nesbitt, to a show called Utopia Station, where we looked at different notions of utopia and trembling utopia, as Edward Glissant says. And for her, it was a very unusual invitation, because she had spent her entire life as one of the great filmmakers of our time, showing her movies in film festivals. So obviously there is a format, feature film, 80, 90 minutes. If it's 30 minutes, it can't be in competition. And then there is a short film festival, but there's relatively little freedom within that. And all of a sudden, it was very fascinating to read what happened when she got this invitation, because suddenly she said she felt liberated, because she could do something she never did before. And she tells the story, you know, that she decided to actually do an installation about her film about potatoes. She calls it Patat Utopia, a form of a potato utopia. And you know, not only did she combine the film with real potatoes in the space, but she came, and she was already in her 70s then, she came to Venice disguised as a potato and did, you know, in the heat of Venice, an amazing performance. So in a way to read her perspective of getting our invitation, so the way also, it shows us also how exciting it is to kind of break down silos and suddenly invite somebody who isn't from the art world to an exhibition. And that's of course also happening when all of a sudden, you know, as a curator I'm invited from the art world into another world, into the science world or the architecture world, or as here, Steffi's DLD, to actually, you know, curate in an unusual context. It always produces different reality.
I love in her text, I'm just looking at it again, how she says that for years your project has really been to record memories in words. And I think that's a kind of beautiful sort of way of describing your particular project. Let's go through a lightning round, like a true lightning round, and I'll ask you a bunch of questions and you can just say quick answers. Do you have a favorite text in the book?
Yeah, so it's difficult to answer that because I kind of love all the texts, but I think there is a story in Mantia Diawara's text which I found super fascinating because I had forgotten about this. Because Mantia, who is the great filmmaker and scholar, reminded me of the story that actually on the occasion of Edouard Glissant's 80th anniversary, and you know, Glissant was my mentor, the great philosopher, pioneer of ideas of crealization and archipelago, and I read him every morning for 15 minutes. So it's kind of like my daily ritual. It's my most important author. And when Glissant turned 80, there was a big party for his 80th anniversary. And at his 80th anniversary, and that's what Mantia tells us, you know, he saw me and then took me by the hand and went everywhere through the crowd trying to find Mantia Diawara. And it took us about 20 minutes, it was a big, you know, party to find Mantia. And he basically put us together and he said, you know, I want you to be friends. And it kind of sort of reminded me, because it's something I really do every day. You know, I think every morning I wake up, I think we need to introduce friends to each other, practitioners to each other who don't know each other. I do it every day. I mean, here, of course, it's amazing because we can make so many introductions in one day. And so I kind of, you know, rereading that, realized that maybe it all started with Edouard Glissant.
Okay. Was there anything untrue in the book?
Anything?
Untrue?
I have to go through the list. Yeah, there is something untrue, actually. And that's kind of really funny, because the poet Sophie Collins...
Is this not true?
No. She kind of, but then it became true, because she actually imagined this idea. It's a poem, Zizio, and she imagines this idea that I would interview a swan in Kensington Gardens. I work at the Serpentine in London, and the Serpentine galleries are, you know, in the park, and every day, of course, walking through the park, I always walk to work, I see the swans. And so she imagined that I would interview the swans. And so, yeah, so that wasn't true at the moment the book came out, but it is now true because I actually have done it.
Well, she did. When I first met Sophie, and Sophie's a really brilliant poet based in Glasgow, she said to me that you would wake up every morning before the sun would rise and go on a jog through Kensington Gardens, and you would wake up the swans, because you don't think anyone should really be sleeping as much as the swans. So that was my sort of first introduction to you. And I thought, wow, that's interesting.
And your text has to do with coffee.
Yes.
Can you tell us? Because it's to do with coffee, and it connects to what I said previously, connects to Etelatnan.
Right. Well, I don't remember. I wrote it quite a while ago, but my text, I was in Hans Ulrich's office. This was not long after Sophie told me this story. I might have been with Sophie that day. And you said, do you want a cup of coffee? And I said, sure, because I was exhausted and quite jet-lagged from coming over from New York. And so someone brought in a French press, and Hans Ulrich stepped out, and we were in his office in the Serpentine, which had many papers, and there was a beautiful catalog of Etelatnan's work, who's a great poet and artist who I'm such a fan of. And there were several laptop computers, and I started to press down on the French press, and you probably know where this is going, and it wouldn't it just wouldn't go down. And I'm also American and impatient. So I was pressing, and finally I just slammed it and it exploded all over Hans Ulrich's office on every imaginable surface except for me. But it hit the book, it hit the papers, it hit all the laptops, the walls were covered in coffee. There was more coffee in that French press than existed in all of London at that time. We were flooded. So I wrote about that.
And I think we're out of time. But I think it's great to end on coffee.
Yes.
Coffee, coffee, coffee.
Coffee.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.